else is in there? There's Alice Jameson. She was the second female police magistrate or judge in the Commonwealth. So Emily Murphy being the first. Who else is out here? There is Colonel McLeod's just down there. There is John Ware's just down there. Peter Prince's second, third, and fourth wife is down there. And if you want to hear the story of that one, you got to come on a tour in the summer. So this is Marion Moody, RN. Marion was actually the first trained nurse in what would be Alberta. She trained at our original hospital. The original hospital in Calgary was actually a gift from a Chinese man who came out here and westernized. He was a cook in the good restaurants here in Calgary and left about $1,200 to start a hospital because he died of tuberculosis and there was no hospital at that time. So it was Cottage Hospital. If you've been to Heritage Park, they have a replica of Cottage Hospital out there. The original Cottage Hospital was on the east side of town. It was on the wrong side of the tracks. It was a 4-bedroom house that they purchased, and it was said to have had 3 bullet holes in the front door because it was on that wrong side of town. And the Heritage Park one doesn't have the 3 bullet holes, and I personally think they should shoot the door, but that's just me. So she trained there, and then she eventually, Cottage Hospital would become the General Hospital. But during the war, Marion Moody did not go over. She did not put on a uniform and go over, but she helped with the medical training here in Canada for the soldiers that came back. So if you died in Europe, you were buried in Europe. If you survived and came back to Canada and then died, you're buried in our field of honor. So all those gentlemen that are buried in that field of honor, and they are all men, they all died here in Canada. If they had died in France or Flanders, they'd be buried over there, or in England. So Marion helped with the medical care for veterans back over here. Now, Canadian nurses in the First World War were very interesting ladies. At that time in Canada, we did have a training program for nurses. We're one of the few countries that did. We had a very good system. In Canada, in order to train to be a nurse, because they wanted women who were serious about their career, and you weren't serious about your career if you married because you couldn't have one. So they wanted women who were serious about their career. So the women had to be at least 23, and they had to have the financial backing to go to school. So that meant most of our nurses were not young girls, and they tended to be more upper class and much better educated. So we had a very good quality of nurses. And when we sent nurses over to France and Flanders in the First World War, a lot of them got poached by the English. So you find Canadian nurses turning up all over the place where Canadian soldiers weren't stationed because the Brits were plucking them out and sending them over there, such as in Greece and Salonika and places like that. Now, Canadian nurses were unique in the First World War because Canada was the only country who fought in the First World War on either side whose nurses were actually members of the military. So Canadian nurses held the rank of lieutenant or higher, so they were officers, and they had all rights and privileges of that rank, except they couldn't take command in a combat situation. So our nurses were all officers, and they were serving members of the Canadian military. It was very, very unique back there. They were highly, highly praised, highly recognized. Canadian soldiers greatly appreciated the professionalism of our nurses. They called them Blue Angels because they wore blue uniforms. They valued our nurses so much that here in Alberta, one of the 2 women that were the first to be elected into provincial legislature was a nurse, and she was elected in Europe. So in Europe, they didn't divide you up into your provinces or where you came from. Canada held its elections, and then at the time of the elections, they would group all the soldiers together, and then they would vote for whoever they wanted out of the candidates in Europe. So they wouldn't be voting for a Canadian politician, they'd be voting for a Canadian politician in Europe. So we had among the first women to serve in a provincial legislature, and it was Rachel McAdams was our lady.
What?
What?
Sorry, did you say McAdams?
Yeah, Rachel McAdams.
Okay, cool.
Who did you?
Rachel McAdams, it's an actress, sorry.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right. Not her. Someone else,
Not
yeah.
the pretty lady, different Rachel McAdams.
Our Rachel McAdams was pretty too. Yes, but she was okay. Now that you say that, yes, there is. She's a redhead, isn't she?
Yes.
So Rachel McAdams made it up there. Now, because they were serving members of the military, our nurses got the penny if they died in that, and things like that. And we did lose quite a few nurses over in Europe, including 14 nurses that were on a ship called the Llandovery Castle. Has anyone ever heard of the Llandovery Castle? Okay, you can't come on any more tours. So the Llandovery Castle was a British hospital ship. And she brought wounded Canadian soldiers from Europe back to Canada, and then she would sail back to Europe. Rules around hospital ships had been around since the time of Henry VIII. That's how old they were. Hospital ships had to be fully lit at night. They had to have the Red Cross prominently displayed on them. They did not travel in convoys, and of course they could not carry arms or ammunition, so they could only carry wounded soldiers. They couldn't carry healthy soldiers back over to Europe to fight. Llandovery Castle fit all of those categories. She was a full-fledged hospital ship. She was taking wounded Canadian soldiers across to Halifax. When she arrived in Halifax, she picked up a large contingent of members of the Canadian Medical Corps. There was 317, I believe there was, a very large group of medical corps personnel, and she was transporting them back to England. And as she was crossing the Atlantic, she was fully lit at night. She was traveling by herself, and she was clearly marked with a Red Cross. And she was attacked by a German U-boat. They fired a torpedo and struck her amidship. She split into two. The back end was still going at full power because it didn't have time to turn off the engine. It actually rammed the front half, and the ship went down. 14 Canadian nurses died on the Llandovery Castle. They went into the water and they died. The Atlantic, of course, is very, very cold, so you go hypothermic very quickly. So they were killed there. She went down so fast that they could only launch a few lifeboats. About 3 or 4 lifeboats actually got off her. So we lost a lot of members of our medical corps. But it was the nurses that caused the most outrage. And a rescue ship that came by the next day talked about seeing them floating on the water, and that of course they wore the big full skirts. Their skirts were all out, and they said they looked like angels floating on the water with their uniform. So people were very, very upset. It was an attack on a hospital ship, and then, you know, the women being killed. To make matters worse, the U-boat, after it sunk the Llandovery Castle, surfaced, and they took the highest ranking officer they could find who had survived in the lifeboats, which was a Canadian major, and they took him on board the lifeboat, and they tried to make him sign a confession saying that the Llandovery Castle had been carrying arms and therefore was a legitimate military target. And when he refused to do that, they put him back in the lifeboat. The captain sent all but his 2 most trusted lieutenants down below. They machine gunned the lifeboats, and then they went under and disappeared. And the Llandovery Castle survivors were picked up the next day and told their story. Of course, there was huge outrage across the United Kingdom, but especially in Canada. Massive outrage on this. This is just not what you do. And there's actually battles that are called the Llandovery Castle battles, because when the news hits the trenches and the Canadian soldiers heard what had happened, their battle cry became, "Remember the Llandovery Castle," when they went into battle against the Brits. This happened in 1917, so it was at the end of the war. The last 100 days of the First World War were the active period. That's when we were smashing the German lines and pushing them back. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of anger back then. And after the war, at the end of the war, when we were doing that Treaty of Versailles stuff in 1919 in Paris, Canada insisted that Britain bring the Llandovery Castle forward as a war crime. Canada did not have a seat at the table. Neither Australia or New Zealand or India or any of the colonies of Britain did not have a seat at the table. Britain was expected to speak for us. So we put enormous amounts of pressure on Britain. We put enormous amounts of pressure on the Germans to bring the captain and those 2 lieutenants up to trial for war crimes. And Britain was not keen on doing any war crimes because people wanted the Kaiser to stand for doing war crimes for pushing the war in the first place. And of course, King Edward realized that if you put the Kaiser or the German king on trial, you were kind of undermining this whole divine right of king Yes, Britain was a constitution, but Edward still didn't want any more of his powers eroded, so he was truly trying to keep that quiet. So Canada insisted that Britain bring this forward. But how we did it back then, we did not have like the Versailles trials that we have, the Second World War. We made Germany put these men on trial. The captain disappeared. He disappeared into a free city, so we never got a hold of him, but we got the two lieutenants. The two lieutenants were put on trial. They were sentenced to hard labor in jail. They were put on a prison train, and both managed to escape and get away. So no one actually did any time for the Landover Castle. And when Hitler came to power, he pardoned all three of them. So no one actually served any time for it. But it was a massive, massive outrage in Canada. And the treatment of how Britain tried to resist, in part how Britain tried to resist bringing this forward as a war crime, as well as the fact that we didn't think Britain did a really great job of running the war anyways, that led, and it was a direct result of the Westminster Treaty, and the Westminster Treaty was a way of breaking Canada away from Britain, and that's why we declared war in the First World War, because we took that power away from Britain, that she could no longer speak for us. So that's the Landover Castle, ladies. That's the only contribution the women have to this tour today, because unfortunately women didn't play a huge role back then. All right, what time is it?